evening, everyone. Washington is broken, and there is no shortage of people, if you turn on the TV or read a blog, who are complaining about the state of Washington and the inability to deal with the big problems of the day. Routine issues, such as passing a budget, now seem impossible. Dealing with big issues, immigration, climate change, inequality, seem to be off the table. I had a student who came into my office a couple years ago. He came to Princeton, best and the brightest. He had done a lot of work on a particular issue in high school, and he came with the intention of public policy, of going into government, and he came into my office in 2011. He sat across the table from me, and he said, "Professor, I think I'm going to go into the private sector." He says, "I'm watching what's going on in Washington. I still care about the issues, but it seems fruitless almost to go to Washington and try to address them that way. I'd rather go into another arena," and I didn't have a great answer at the time because I was watching the same thing. Complaints about Washington being broken are nothing new. Since 1885, when Woodrow Wilson, then a scholar, published a book called Congressional Government, political scientists have been calling for the reform of Washington and looking at ways to make the system work better. Mark Twain said, "Suppose you were an idiot, and suppose you were a member of Congress." But I repeat myself. In 1897, I found an editorial from a newspaper writing about the Senate, and they said, "To be a member of the Senate is to be suspect." I'm now writing about the 1960s, and early in the 1960s, there was a cottage industry of journalists, of politicians, of scholars writing about how Washington was broken. Then it was a coalition of Southern conservative Democrats who controlled the committees of Washington, and Midwestern Republicans who formed a coalition that blocked progress on civil rights, on health care for the aged, on urban renewal, and many other issues that people were asking for legislative solutions for. And then, too, Senator Joseph Clark, a famous liberal at the time, called Congress the sapless branch of government. Clark said that this coalition of conservatives was a defender of white supremacy and the importance of property rights over human rights. In my final year of graduate school, I spent it in 1995 and 96 at the Brookings Institution in Washington, and I remember sitting in my office, which was the size of a closet, but at the time was terrific to have an office, but watching in the winter as Washington shut down. And I saw all kinds of experts and politicians coming through Brookings talking about how Congress couldn't reach a deal, how we had shut down the government because the divisions were so big, how incivility now ruled Washington. So this is an old complaint, and I think we need to remember that. But at the same time, we need to remember there are moments in American history where we've had big breakthroughs, where a lot of legislation does start to come out of Washington, or where we actually reform politics so that it works better. And I think there's three things that have happened in those moments that have been quite important, that remain important today. The first is that social movement pressure is always essential to fixing Washington. Washington will rarely fix itself on its own. Politicians are invested in the status quo. They are comfortable at a certain level with things continuing as is. So early in the 20th century, the progressive era of American politics, as it was called, there are all kinds of changes that take place in the way politics works, in the way we vote, in the way government workers are hired, in the kinds of government programs we have. And social movement pressure was very important during that period. Middle-class reformers were very active in demanding that certain kinds of changes take place. Women activists working in settlement houses in places like Chicago were forcing politicians at the turn of the 20th century to start dealing with issues such as immigration and poverty. During the early 1960s, this period I'm writing about, the reason we finally have a breakthrough in government with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Great Society is not because politicians all of a sudden figured out it's time to do the right thing, or it's not because Lyndon Johnson was just a wizard of politics, a magician who knew exactly how to make the system work, but a civil rights movement had fundamentally rocked the country. It had forced politicians and citizens to deal with the racial injustice that existed in the South and in the North. The civil rights movement created grassroots pressure on politicians. They also lobbied in Washington to force politicians to move forward with bills. One of the key people in the whole civil rights story was Republican Senator Everett Dirksen, the Senate Minority Leader, who eventually breaks the Southern filibuster against civil rights. It's a classic story if you study this period. But the reason he did that was not just a change of heart, but the movement had affected him and other Midwestern Republicans because of the kinds of stories that were coming out in the media and the pressure in states like Illinois to do something, to vote the right way on this bill. Finally, during the 1970s, we have a lot of changes in the way the government works, changes in campaign finance and other issues. And one of the important factors is that there are many organizations and middle-class suburban citizens working through groups like Common Cause, Ralph Nader's Congress Watch, who are putting issues in the wake of Watergate on the table. Issues like campaign finance, and they are making reporters cover these stories. They are asking candidates during campaigns, where do you stand on the issue? And later they would remind reporters, once those candidates were politicians, what they had promised. So social movement pressure is extraordinarily important. It remains so today. And this is an area we don't see much action. And certainly we're going to have to see more pressure from the bottom up if Washington is going to be fixed. A second important factor in fixing Washington is the need to repair institutions, not just have new kinds of leadership. What do I mean? Every so often, every presidential election, we hear talk that new kinds of leaders, that's the solution. New kinds of leaders need to come to Washington, who will bring people together, who will transform the way Washington works, who will represent a new way of doing business. We heard this with President Obama in 2008. We heard this with George W. Bush in 2000 and many times before. But the reality is, unless we repair our political institutions, the rules of politics, the processes of politics, the same kind of problems will keep reemerging. And here, too, there's a lot of examples where we have changed the way Washington works. During the Progressive era, there were many reforms. For example, voting changed very dramatically during that period, where voting became much more of a private act, and the ability of machine politicians to literally hover over people as they put their ballot in the box to check if they were on your side evaporated and disappeared. The passage of the 17th Amendment was a huge change in American politics, the direct election of senators, which broke the power of machine politicians in state legislators who previously selected who would be senator and empowered average voters to vote for who would be in the upper chamber. After the landslide Democratic victories in 1964, Democrats put into effect a series of important rules changes in the House of Representatives that made it more difficult for those old, crusty Southern Democrats to simply say no to the legislation that Lyndon Johnson sent to the Hill. During the 1970s, after Watergate, reformers didn't just say we have to do things better. They actually called for changes in government that made things different. So campaign finance reforms in 1974 created a publicly financed presidential campaign system, which actually lasted until about 2000, when it finally broke down and did diminish the power of private money in presidential campaigns. We instituted contribution limits and stronger disclosure laws that changed the nature of campaign finance. We passed openness and sunshine laws that made it harder for politicians to do all their business behind closed doors. We also enacted all kinds of ethics rules for the legislative branch and the executive branch that made actions once permissible illegal. For a while, we had an office of an independent prosecutor that was in charge of investigating corruption in the executive branch. These reforms didn't always work well. Some of them didn't last, but it is another example of how there are moments when we actually focus on repairing the way our institutions work. And I think today we need to do the same. We need to look at issues like another round of campaign finance reforms that diminish the pressure of legislators to constantly scramble for money and to be beholden to single issue groups that make it difficult to compromise. We need to look at reforming the filibuster. The filibuster in the Senate now requires 60 senators to end a filibuster. And before the 70s, filibusters were rarely used in Congress. They were a tool reserved for very high priority or high profile issues like civil rights. But since the 1970s, filibusters have become a tool of partisan combat used on the smallest issue. And the result is that in the Senate, you need 60 votes to pass almost any bill. And this facilitates gridlock, because in a polarized Congress, to get 60 votes is almost impossible. We've reformed the filibuster before. In 1975, we lowered the number of senators required to end a filibuster, and it's probably time to start thinking about that again. Another final area of reform has been budget reform, now discussed. Maybe eliminating or reforming this whole debt ceiling that has become a procedure used to extract certain demands in budget negotiations. So institutional reform is a second issue that I think needs to be on the table. And finally, we need to think more about the news media. The news media is not simply something that reports on politics, but the news media is something that plays a role in our current politics. And it's important not to have nostalgia for the media either. In the 19th century, the media was even more partisan than it is today. The newspapers were literally appendages of the parties. In the heyday of objective journalism, in the 1940s and 1950s, reporters often just said whatever a politician articulated from Capitol Hill, whether it was true or not. So Senator Joseph McCarthy, the anti-communist red baiter, loved to just put accusations out in the press that reporters would then report without analysis. Even investigative journalism after Watergate, the kind that was done by Woodward and Bernstein so successfully that helped bring down Richard Nixon, often descended, critics said, into a search for scandal and a search for personal problems rather than big political questions by the 80s. But today we need to think about how the media works. The two big problems in the media that play into the current politics, one is the 24-hour news cycle, which structurally creates a competition between different news outlets to get information out quickly and often without much editorial control. And this often makes negotiation in Washington extraordinarily difficult. News about negotiations is out before everyone in the room has even finished speaking. And often false information gets out very quickly. And we have also seen the reemergence of a very partisan press in certain cases. Since the end of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, which had required balanced presentations of issues, and the creation of certain stations in the past decade or so, the news has become openly polemical and openly partisan. So not only does it get out more quickly, not only does it often get out more sloppily, but it is often then reported through very partisan lens. Fixing the media is the hardest of the three in some ways. That's a conversation that will have to take place in journalism schools. It's a conversation that will have to take place in network boardrooms. It's a conversation that will have to take place in regulatory bodies in Washington. It's impossible to put the genie back into the bottle. But certainly we could have discussions of different kinds of news outlets that will provide different kinds of reporting that don't play into the partisanship and the gridlock, but help us move beyond it. So the point of my talk is not just to say Washington's always broken, and not just to say I can give you a million examples where things were worse than they are today. But the point is also to say we've had, although they're rare, key periods in American history where things do get better. When we have legislative breakthroughs or where we have reforms in the government process. And we are clearly reaching that point today where that is needed. This will require big thinkers, it will require big changes, and it will require big political pressure. But at this point, it's clear that our citizens need this, our government needs this, and in a global age, the world is depending on it. Thank you very much.